At the peak of Victorian prosperity, Glasgow was one of the richest cities of the world. And despite the changes a century later, it's still a city of great wealth, a fierce pride in its people and its traditions. The National Trust for Scotland know that, and held in trust here in Scotland's industrial heartland are some of the most interesting places you will ever visit.
Travel west from Glasgow and you'll come to the coastal resort of Helensburgh. In its heyday, wealthy Glaswegians built their homes here, and none is more individual than Hill House. Charles Rennie Mackintosh, one of Scotland's greatest architects, designed it in the early 1900s, and it's the only Mackintosh house which still contains the original furniture. Approach the gates, and Mackintosh's distinctive Art Nouveau style is apparent.
Hill House was commissioned by the publisher
Walter Blackie
in 1902, and the family lived in it for nearly 50 years. It then changed hands, but finally came to the trust in 1982, just in time, for the house had been allowed to fall into a sad state of deterioration. With the help of the National Heritage Memorial Fund, the trust set about restoring it.
Mackintosh's design, with its cliff-like walls and tapering chimneys, has been called peculiar by some. But to Walter Blackie's young daughters, Agnes and Ruth, who came here in 1904, Hill House was home.
I remember arriving very clearly. I think it was my 9th birthday. And my recollection is a lovely feeling of space and light as a little girl, and the feeling that you could run from end to end and that sort of thing, and just a general feeling of room.
I never thought it was peculiar at all. It's just my home. So little so that when, at some later stage I was in Glasgow and somebody took me to tea in the Miss Cranston's room de luxe, I just thought, this is all like home. I never thought this peculiar in any way, the Mackintosh decor. It was just there.
I remember Mr. Mackintosh standing with his back to the library fire, talking. He and my father were probably discussing this and that. And I think I sat on a chair and just was there. I don't remember him very well as a person, but I remember the look of him very well indeed. I love the hall. I love the design in the hall. And all the subtle shades of blue that he got.
I personally am not so fond of his interior decor, the furniture and things. I saw Mrs. Mackintosh. She did that design above the drawing room mantelpiece after we were in the house. I think it was called gesso work, is that right?
Gesso.
Gesso.
And then, of course, the dark ceiling was done because the lights in each corner were very big, heavy cage lights, and it was the days of gas, and Mackintosh thought the room looked too high. The drawing room window, I always remember especially loving it. The rather lovely moulded wood pillars that seemed to hold up the ceiling. I was really unaware of anything that was unusual about the house. It was just our house, and a very nice family house to live in. Later on, I think, as one grew up, began to notice designs and certain bits that one loved. And I don't think I ever thought of people thinking it was peculiar. I don't know what my sister would say to that.
Did visitors find it peculiar? Never told me if they did. They seem to enjoy coming.
I always loved the staircase. I think that I can remember that at the very beginning, the spars on the top of the stair had a gap between them and were very soon filled in because the smaller ones of the family found they could go between the gap and out again and in and out again. My father, who was very fond of the house, used to be a little afraid that no one would want to live in it. And I also remember my father saying, rather wistfully, perhaps the National Trust would take it over. So that in the end, that is what has happened.
This is the white bedroom, and it's very striking. The black ladder-back chairs stand in severe contrast. There, a small window, designed so that those in bed can look directly out at the view. And look at the use of inlaid coloured glass on the bed head and on the doors. Originally, the walls were stenciled in a formalized flower pattern. Here, repeated on the cupboards. All these aesthetic and practical details were all part of a very distinctive design. This tenement house at 145 Buccleuch Street in Glasgow is a very different kind of home from the sculptured elegance of Mackintosh's Hill House. In every way, visiting this home is like stepping back in time. For what's preserved inside in extraordinary detail is a way of life unique to Glasgow. It was all saved at the very last minute by the good sense and eye of a young woman. Anna Davidson was a young actress when, in 1975, her uncle took her to the late Agnes Toward's flat to collect 6 chairs, part of Miss Toward's bequest. Anna and her uncle couldn't find the chairs, but what they did find was a time capsule, more evocative of the 1920s than the 1970s.
I was just fascinated by it and thought somebody ought to do something. Made inquiries and discovered that nobody was. It was just going to be cleared as a heap of old rubbish and then put on the market as it stood. So I took a deep breath and bought it. It was filthy dirty because it had been empty for 10 years while she was in hospital. So it was full of rubbish, apart from all the interesting things. Not a lot of junk. And gradually made a small habitable corner and then moved in and started living here. Slowly went through drawers, cupboards, boxes. There were a tremendous number of papers, newspapers, and letters, and postcards, photographs, and a lot of material because her mother had been a dressmaker. All the fireplaces were here, the range was still here, all the bathroom plumbing was original, the furniture was all belonging to the house.
Anna Davidson's acting commitments eventually forced her to sell the flat, but her faith in its unique record of a way of life convinced the National Trust for Scotland that they should acquire it. Anna Davidson knew that Agnes Toward's magpie nature had preserved a slice of history in a most human way.
You lived here with her mother until 1939 when her mother died, and then she lived on alone. And she was a person who I think kept very much to herself. She was friendly and pleasant with the people in the office, but didn't socialise a great deal. I think she found that things suited her the way they were. There was no particular reason to change. There weren't children in the house, and they're often the reason for change. They come back and say, oh, that's old-fashioned, we must have a new this, that, and the other. And she didn't have a lot of money, so she wasn't inclined to spend money on altering things that were all right the way they were. When the Trust took it over, I hoped that it would be interesting to Glaswegians, both young ones who would never have seen a house like this but might have heard their grandparents speaking about it, and older people who maybe were brought up in houses like this but hadn't seen one since. And I think also it's useful for people from maybe the south of England who associate tenements in Glasgow with slums and gorges and all the bad things, to see that a tenement house can be a very pleasant, comfortable, nice place to live.
On the other side of Glasgow, at Greenbank Gardens, there's a very different educational project, operated by the Trust for young visitors and old.
So many people were asking where they could see Scotch thistles, so we've now got them established and some more seedlings to be planted out. But on this side,
Jim May is the Trust's resident gardening instructor in 2.5 acres of garden surrounding an elegant Georgian house. On Thursdays, he gives gardening tips and lessons, and he aims his talks particularly at owners of small gardens.
Well, here we have the arbutelon. You'll recall we had it covered with some shade netting.
Greenbank also provides a custom-designed garden for the disabled, which provides opportunities for them to work with specially constructed aids.
The heat has brought out the flowers fairly quickly.
Nearby, another handicraft is the focal point at the little village of Kilbarchan. This cottage, known as the Weaver's Cottage, is one of the original houses of the village. It was built at the end of the 18th century. Kilbarchan was at the centre of a weaving industry which prospered for 200 years. Cambrics, muslins and lawns were produced in their thousands of lengths on looms like this, with its full complement of reeds, shuttles, spinning and pern wheels. While typical examples of Kilbarchan weaving are on display in the Weaver's Cottage, including 19th century ponchos made for the States, Egypt and South America, the living quarters are equally interesting. These too have been restored with painstaking care. Exquisite handmade linen forms a matchless collection, and the old box beds were never so well dressed. And look again at the walls. The decoration of blue spots was done by hand, by thumb to be precise. You can also clearly see the once common cruck structure system, where the weight of the roof was carried not by walls, but by a wooden framework of tree trunk trusses, the forerunner of the modern steel-framed building. It was an independent community which fed as well as clothed itself. There's evidence of this self-sufficiency in the gardens, where there's a bee bowl in the wall to take 3 skeps of bees. But if you're looking for magnificence, the spectacular and ever-varied sunsets on the west coast are hard to better. Look across the waters of the glowing sea in the evening to the islands of the west. Here you will find Glasgow's favourite holiday ground, the Isle of Arran. Arran's dramatic scenery and soft light have inspired artists and made it a place of great beauty. The National Trust for Scotland are fortunate to own two beautiful properties here, Brodick Castle and an impressive mountain, Goat Fell, the Mountain of the Winds, rising to almost 3,000 feet. The rock climbing and ridge walking available to the adventurous are famed, and in May there's a race up this tough and rugged mountain. Here the lucky hill walker may still see the deer, buzzard and falcon that claim Goat Fell as home, but there are less energetic ways to enjoy the mountain. The Ranger Service, which operates in Brodick's Gardens and Country Park, will organise walks on Goat Fell and explain the special features of the mountain.
Well, here we are in Glen Rosa, and if you'd been standing here something like 15,000 years ago, you'd have been under a large sheet of ice, some hundreds of feet thick. And it was this ice that gouged out the glen here, running up to the below Kirvor there, coming right down the glen and through to Brodick. You can also see where, comparatively recently, we had a fire on the side of the glen, which has really made quite a mark on the landscape. And if we go on, we'll go up and have a look at some other features in the glen.
Goat Fell doesn't top the magic figure of 3,000 feet, and therefore it's not a Munro, but it is the highest point on one of the country's most satisfying and splendid ridge walks, 13 linked summits overlooking 3 big glens. On a clear day, you can see the peaks of the Lake District and Northern Ireland, the mountains of Argyll, and the long tongue of Kintyre reaching south to the coast of Ulster, and proving a fitting reward for the persevering climber. A ranger will show you the easier routes to attain these views. 10,000 climbers make the summit every year. It'll take you a steady 2 hours. But Goat Fell has had its share of the macabre.
In July 1889, Goat Fell acquired a more sinister reputation when it became the scene of the Arran murder. A Glasgow pattern maker, John Laurie Watson, battered to death his English friend of just a few days' acquaintanceship and threw his body down Quaman Furran, down there, the Gully of Fire. Laurie took to the mainland and was on the run for several weeks before being arrested and tried. He was sentenced to death, but surprisingly reprieved, and spent the last 41 years of his life in prison, taking with him to the grave the terrible secret of what really happened here that day on the Mountain of the Winds.
In contrast to the rugged grandeur of the Arran Hills, Brodick Castle at the foot of the mountain could hardly be more civilised. The ancient seat of the Dukes of Hamilton, it now attracts 50,000 visitors every year.
Brodick Castle was rebuilt in the 19th century by Scots architect Gillespie Graham, and he continued the design in red sandstone of the existing building, mostly 16th century with a few 13th century stones, and a wing added by Oliver Cromwell as a battery and garrison accommodation. The oldest part is the East Tower, and for the most part it sets the design for all the rest, rather severe and baronial on the outside. On the inside, however, it is very different.
The first sight to greet the visitor's eye is the quite breathtaking display of stag's heads in the front hall, which rises up the stairwell in a fitting memorial to the Hamiltons' fondness for the chase. There are 87 heads here, 86 shot on the